the name of Christ crucified. Amen. Good teachers say things that you remember for a long time. When I was in seminary, one of our professors would remind us at the end of each theological unit that we needed to understand how people could benefit from what we had just learned. If the offer was of salvation freely offered to all, how were we to appropriate it? How would we make it our own? What needs to happen to take it in? If this offer is freely given, how do you take it? How do you take, accept, received the gift of the crucified God? How do we make this our own? You had a sort of an odd little moment at the communion rail a couple of Sundays ago, and during the Lenten Sundays, the children were with us for communion, and quite a few of them are receiving communion already, and others are just being prepared. And as I passed one little boy, he said to his mother, "Does this actually mean anything?" I wanted to stop and have a little conversation at the rail, but that wouldn't have been the right thing to do. You know, from a grown-up, the question I think I would have taken as rude, but not from him. And actually, it's the right question, or at least one of the questions that will get us to the right question. Does this mean anything? Is it more than just a story? It's a saving story. It's a story that means everything to us, actually. But how do we take it in? You know, I realized this week, if this was a movie, I wouldn't go. You know? It took me years to see Sophie's Choice, and I still haven't seen Schindler's List. The movies that I hear people come away from disturbed or weeping, I avoid. My 21-year-old self very strongly disapproves of this, but as I've gotten older, I just don't want to go to the movies to feel bad. I want to go to the movies to feel good. If this were a movie, I don't think I'd be there. On the other hand, I think I wouldn't want to see it on the screen, because I wouldn't want to have added in that special brutality that the cinema can deliver. I don't really feel the need to have anything added to this story. I don't need the cinematographers for this. God knows I don't need Mel Gibson. Because the story, and I mean that with a capital S, not a fiction, the true story has this extraordinary, perfect weight. And the work that we have as we travel toward receiving it and its meaning, the work we have is to find the way to take up that weight and bring in close as much of it as we can bear. People have always had trouble with this story. Back as far as the first centuries, within years of the event, the objections mainly fell into two camps. Some objected that the story was simply absurd because no God would die. What use to us is a God who can die? We want our gods powerful, impervious, always victorious, and other than us. It would be absurd, ridiculous, they said, that a God should die. Either Jesus wasn't God or he didn't really die. They flipped back and forth over that for years, and we get that. But it's actually the outpouring of a God who is willing to die that captures our attention. Judas, the betrayer, if we look more closely at the translation, is the hander over. The betrayal is the handing over. That moment at which Jesus, the God friend, falls into the hands of human sinners. Judas hands over the God who has already been handed over in the incarnation. Jesus the Son has been handed over as soon as he is conceived and born in the manger at Bethlehem. He has been turned over to humankind for their care, their love, and their eventual abuse. And he is handed over again to Judas. And when he dies, he hands over his own spirit to the Father. He becomes passive. He lets things happen to him. He allows terrible things to happen to him. Terrible things that happen to human beings all the time. And this brings us to the other part of the story that we find grossly offensive, which is that is it a deeply true story about the bad things human beings do. We have quite a scuffle over the Gospel of John on this point, because he always refers to human beings in this story as the Jews. It's hard for us to hear because we don't remember when we hear the Gospel of John that it was written by Jews to Jews. It means us. The Jews who hand him over are us. We are the bloodthirsty, angry, envious, cowardly, double-talking people who betray him. We don't like this very much. We don't like it because it's recognizable. I don't know about you, but the part that smells the most familiar in this chronicle is the foot shuffling that goes on between Pilate and Herod, Pilate and the leaders who want to have him crucified. The Jewish leaders cannot order his crucifixion. It's against their law for that to happen. According to Roman law, only Pilate has the authority to order this crucifixion. But Pilate needs to stay under the radar with Caesar. Pilate is probably just trying to keep the peace, but I don't mean that in a positive way. He's trying to manage these unruly crowds in Jerusalem at the time of the Passover. They are simply a headache to him, not someone to be taken seriously. This is a joke. Pilate doesn't want to be involved in this. He has other things to do. Perhaps dinner plans. He'd like to get off. In John, he begins to sound a little sympathetic because he takes time questioning Jesus, but then when he takes him aside between the questioning of the crowd, he has him flogged. He turns him over to the soldiers so they can make a crown of thorns for him. He has him beaten And before he comes back to the people, Pilate himself strikes Jesus on the face. It's gratuitous, but it sounds all too familiar. And then there's Judas. What are we to make of him? His name is conveniently left out at the points of the gospel where we might have been reminded how much Jesus loved him. Do you think for a moment that Judas did not have the bread and the wine at the Last Supper? Of course he did. Do we think that Jesus skipped him when he washed the disciples' feet? Of course not. Could he actually have gone to hand his beloved teacher over after that same man had fed him and washed his feet? It's gross. It's an outrage. And it's us. Not all of us. Not all of us some of the time. Some of us not all of the time, but we know the scent of the thing. We know how quickly human loyalties can shift. We know how tricky the balance of social and political power can be. We know what fear can do to people, how it brings out the worst in us, how it causes us to make angry gestures when honestly we're simply afraid. And then there's that mysterious gene we have for taking pleasure in the suffering of others. The Germans have that wonderful name for it, Schadenfreude. How bad can it get? How awful. But we get it. And that's the other part of the story that makes us so uncomfortable. Because if we do our work on Good Friday, we get that God will die, and we get that had we been there, we might have had a hand in it. This is not good news. This is not good news at all. But then there's Jesus himself. Jesus, who is the object of this abuse, who willingly accepts it, who takes it on the chin, so to speak, and on the back, and on the brow, who lives through the betrayal of one of his closest friends, who predicts and understands that his best boy, Peter, is going to chicken out, who lives through the moment in the garden when the guards come and his closest friends run away, scattered, fleeing, all of them terrified in front of the fate which is about to meet him. And yet, if we can go all the way there, what we find is Jesus giving himself over to this suffering as an act of transformative love. Loving around the table with the bread and the wine, loving on his knees with his hands in the water around the disciples' feet, repeating a gesture that actually has been performed for him just 6 days earlier by his friend Mary of Bethany. Loving Peter as he anticipates Peter's moment of betrayal and fear. Loving them. Accepting the blows, the nails, the mocking. taking it all and asking God that they and we might all be forgiven. All. Remember that word, all. Jesus said, even as the serpent was lifted up in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, so that all who would look on him might be saved. It's a reference to a time in the wilderness when the people of Israel were afflicted by serpent bites, and Moses was ordered to take one of the serpents and raise it up on his rod and hold it up before the people and ask them to look upon it, so that looking upon it, they might live. Getting a good view of the serpent that had bitten them was all they needed to be healed. And Jesus, being lifted up, is showing us not just what human, ordinary, extreme evil can do, but what God's love can do. So that looking on him, we might be transformed. Looking on him, we might come forward looking more like God and less like our mistakes. We need this help. We need this forgiveness. We need it to bridge the gap between the selves we believe we were meant to be and the selves we are managing so far on our own. The perfection for which we have strived, how's that going? We're not making it. Whether it's the throwing off or addiction or the binding of a difficult temper or subduing a cancer or stopping a storm of gossip that has swirled around us or what? We need Christ's forgiveness to help us bridge the gap and to face and to move into that future which is being given for us. He died once for all, so that the death that we believed would surely be coming to us has been averted. We shall not die, but live and call upon the name of the Lord. Of course, the evil still continues. Of course, people are still punishing, killing, expelling one another on the basis of race, religious creed, sexual orientation. Of course, the profiling and the abuse still goes on. People still do act this way. But we don't have to. Because Jesus paid the price so that we might be reborn into fullness of life, so that we might not be just witnesses to his sacrifices, but the bearers of his love in the world. Because he has died, all is forgiven. To receive it, we have simply to open our hearts